Something is happening across the Middle East right now that Washington is trying very hard not to describe honestly. American troops are not just moving around, and they are not simply rotating to new assignments. They are being pulled out of bases that were supposed to be protected, fortified, and ready for exactly this kind of war. And the reason why matters far more than most headlines are willing to admit. Iranian missiles have already hit runways, destroyed radar systems, struck key compounds, and left American soldiers dead and wounded across the region. More than 200 U.S. troops are reported wounded across 7 different countries, and that number alone tells you this is not a controlled situation. 2 U.S. embassies have already been shut down after taking direct hits, and the State Department has told every American citizen in Iraq to leave the country completely. Iran's retaliation is not slowing down. The Strait of Hormuz is shut, oil prices have surged, allies are stepping back, and the United States is spending millions just to keep vulnerable positions functioning. That is not what a war going to plan looks like. But every time the situation gets worse, the words used to describe it somehow become softer, calmer, and more carefully polished. Over the next few minutes, I want to show you why American troops are really being pulled back, what the language shift is hiding, and how this crisis could spiral from a regional war into a global economic shock. And once you see the pattern, it becomes very difficult to unsee what is actually unfolding. The clearest place to begin is Kuwait, because that is where the collapse became too obvious to keep dressing up with better wording. On March 1st, a single Iranian Shahed drone struck the port of Shuaibah in Kuwait and killed 6 soldiers from the 103rd Sustainment Command out of Des Moines, Iowa. These were not frontline assault troops pushing into hostile territory. These were logistics personnel, the people who keep the military functioning behind the scenes, working out of what should have been a relatively secure civilian port facility. The strike came without warning, and that detail is far more important than it may sound at first. Because if a drone can arrive without warning, that means the systems meant to see it first were already down or already blind. And that is exactly what later reporting began to suggest. Satellite imagery published by Bloomberg reportedly showed destroyed early warning radar arrays at Ali al-Salam Air Base and Camp Arifjan in Kuwait. Those radar systems are the eyes of a base. They are what detect incoming drones and missiles before those weapons are close enough to kill. Once those systems are destroyed, the base is no longer operating with awareness. It is operating in the dark, waiting for impact. And once the radars went down, the pullback began. Personnel started leaving exposed positions across Kuwait because the bases were no longer fully defendable. Then the U.S. Embassy itself took a direct Iranian missile strike, and Marco Rubio ordered it closed. One day later, on March the 2nd, Kuwaiti air defenses reportedly shot down 3 American F-15s in a friendly fire incident because situational awareness had degraded that badly. 6 crew members survived, but the message could not have been clearer. The battlefield confusion was no longer theoretical. These positions were becoming impossible to hold safely, and the United States began emptying them out. And here's the part many people still do not fully understand. Kuwait was not the exception. Kuwait was the preview. The same pattern started appearing across the entire region, base after base, country after country, one warning sign after another. In Bahrain, the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet in Jafar took repeated Iranian missile attacks. Hundreds of non-essential personnel had already been moved away from those facilities before the war even fully escalated, and the strikes continued after that. In Qatar, 2 low-flying Iranian bombers reportedly came within 2 minutes of Al Udeid, the largest American base in the Middle East and home to around 10,000 troops. That base had already been partially evacuated twice before February 28th. Think about that for a second. The largest American base in the region was already being thinned out before the public was even told how serious this crisis had become. In Saudi Arabia, Prince Sultan Air Base was struck, and Sergeant Benjamin Pennington was wounded there on March 1st before dying on March 8th. The U.S. Embassy in Riyadh was also hit by drone strikes and later shut down. In the UAE, the American consulate in Dubai was struck as well. Then Iranian state media claimed that American personnel had quietly dispersed into civilian port facilities at Jebel Ali, Khalifa, and Fujairah. Whether every detail of that claim is verified or not, the accusation itself reveals what Iran believes is happening. It believes the United States is moving people out of obvious military targets and into civilian infrastructure because the bases themselves are no longer safe to occupy. In Iraq, the U.S. Embassy strongly urged all American citizens to leave the country as soon as they could do so safely. In Syria, troops completed a withdrawal from Al-Tanf, and American forces also began pulling back from positions in the northeast. When you add all of this together, the picture becomes extremely difficult to soften with better branding. 2 embassies closed after being struck, a full evacuation advisory for Iraq, confirmed withdrawals from Syrian positions. Hundreds moved away from Gulf bases before the first major shots were fired. 13 American service members dead, more than 200 wounded across 7 countries. And yet, the official language still tries to make this sound clean, deliberate, and under control. Some call it a tactical withdrawal. Others call it a redesign of military presence. The White House prefers strategic relocation. Different phrases, same purpose. To make retreat sound like strategy. To make loss of ground sound like a chosen adjustment. To make vulnerability sound like planning. But here is what completely breaks that narrative. This was not the first time these bases were quietly emptied. It was the third time. And that changes everything. On January 14th, 2026, a full 6 weeks before the war formally exploded, Reuters reported that the United States was already withdrawing some personnel from key regional bases as a precaution. Personnel at Al Udeid were reportedly told to leave by that same evening. Britain pulled some of its people out too. The Qatari government confirmed the drawdown. A diplomat described it as a posture change rather than an ordered evacuation. That phrase matters because you can already hear the language management beginning. Even before the missiles, even before the headlines, even before the bodies started coming home, the wording was already being softened. Troops were dispersed into hotels and other scattered facilities away from concentrated military targets. And why was that happening? Because Iran had sent a direct warning to neighboring governments. If America strikes, your bases become our targets. That message was not vague, and it was not subtle. It was a strategic warning with operational consequences, and several Gulf governments appear to have taken it seriously. In late January, multiple Gulf states reportedly assured Tehran that their airspace and territory would not be used by Washington for war operations. But America attacked anyway, and every single base that had been partially evacuated in January was later hit by Iranian missiles on February 28th, exactly as Iran had warned. Then came the second wave. In late February, just days before the joint strike, the evacuations expanded further. Hundreds of non-essential personnel were pulled from Al Udeid and from Fifth Fleet facilities in Bahrain. Gulf News reported that the purpose was to reduce exposure of forces. Turkey's Anadolu agency said it with almost no spin at all. The U.S. evacuates hundreds of troops from Qatar and Bahrain. 3 waves, same bases, same direction. Out. In January, when nothing visible had exploded yet, they called it a posture change. In late February, with a strike clearly approaching, they called it a precautionary evacuation. Now in March, with missiles landing, radars destroyed, embassies shut, and soldiers dead, they call it strategic relocation. The label kept getting softer while the reality kept getting worse. That is not evolving terminology. That is managed denial. That is a government trying to control perception while the facts on the ground keep slipping away from it. And this is where the story gets even more serious because many viewers still think all of this is about military positioning for the next phase of the war. But what if that is not what is happening at all? What if this is not preparation for expansion, but the visible proof that Iran has already made large parts of the U.S. regional posture untenable? Because when forces leave after radars are destroyed, after embassies are hit, after runways are struck, and after friendly fire incidents erupt from confusion, that is not a clean setup for Phase 2. That is a retreat from positions that no longer feel survivable. And while Washington argues over words, Iran has been applying pressure somewhere even more dangerous than the bases. The Strait of Hormuz. And what is happening there may keep hurting the world long after the missile exchanges slow down. On March 2nd, IRGC senior advisor Ibrahim Jabari declared that the strait was closed and warned that any vessel attempting passage could be set ablaze. By March 12th, 21 confirmed attacks on merchant shipping had reportedly followed. Traffic first dropped by around 70%, then effectively collapsed for many Western-flagged vessels. More than 150 ships reportedly anchored outside the strait rather than risk the passage. That is not just disruption, that is paralysis. And here is the part many headlines miss completely. Iran did not need to sink an entire navy to shut down the strait. It only needed to make commercial shipping mathematically irrational. It only needed enough attacks to convince insurers, ship owners, and crews that the risk was no longer acceptable. Once that private sector calculation breaks, the shipping lane stops functioning even if the water itself is still physically open. Major underwriters at Lloyd's of London reportedly stopped issuing new coverage for Hormuz transit after the attacks escalated. Under international maritime law, crews can refuse to sail into a declared war zone. Some captains are reportedly being offered enormous sums, even hundreds of thousands of dollars per day, just to attempt the crossing. That is not normal trade. That is desperation pricing. That is what happens when commerce enters a war zone and stops believing the risk can be managed. And this is where the consequences stop being regional and start becoming global. Roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Around 20% of global LNG moves through it too. Brent crude reportedly jumped from around $65 a barrel before the war to as high as $126. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on LNG shipments on March 4th. Major shipping giants like Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, and CMA CGM suspended operations. And the economic damage is not limited to gasoline prices or power bills. Fertilizer prices have surged too, including urea, which reportedly jumped by around $80 a ton from pre-war levels. That matters because roughly a third of global fertilizer trade passes through Hormuz. So now this crisis is not only threatening energy markets, it is starting to hit agriculture at the exact moment farmers are entering the spring planting season. That means the effects of this conflict could spread from ports to farms, from fuel costs to food prices, from military headlines to grocery bills. This is how a regional war starts touching households thousands of miles away. And then Iran made a move that was even smarter than it looked on the surface. On March 5th, the strait was reportedly declared closed to American, Israeli, and Western Allied vessels, while Turkish ships, Indian flag carriers, and selected others were still allowed to pass. Saudi tankers bound for India reportedly moved through. China, which receives a huge share of its oil through Hormuz, has reportedly been negotiating directly with Tehran for guaranteed safe passage. Japan has already discussed releasing strategic reserves because so much of its Middle Eastern crude depends on that corridor. In other words, Iran is not simply blockading the strait. It is selectively controlling it. It is turning a military choke point into a political toll booth. It is forcing American allies and major economies to negotiate directly with the very country Washington is bombing. That is not just military leverage. That is geopolitical leverage on a global scale. And the American response has looked increasingly confused. One official says the Navy is not ready to escort tankers. Another says escorts will begin as soon as militarily possible. Another waves it off and says there is nothing to worry about. Trump calls on allies to send warships. Japan declines. Australia declines. South Korea declines. The UK declines. Germany declines. Greece declines. Germany reportedly said there would be no participation as long as the war continued. The UK said it would not be drawn into a wider regional conflict. Not one allied nation committed a single vessel. That matters, because military isolation changes the math of deterrence. It tells the region that Washington may be carrying the burden alone. And that is exactly the kind of perception Iran wants to reinforce. Saudi Arabia has tried rerouting crude through its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. By mid-March, tanker traffic through Saudi Red Sea ports had jumped sharply, showing how much export traffic was being diverted away from Hormuz. But even at higher flow rates, that pipeline cannot fully replace what normally moves through the strait. Full capacity still falls short. The gap remains. And even the Red Sea route carries its own security risks. That means there is no easy workaround here. Every alternative is too small, too exposed, too expensive, or too slow, which means the world economy is still tied to a corridor that Iran has shown it can disrupt without having to defeat the U.S. Navy outright. And then the war moved towards something even darker. On March 7th, Iran accused the United States of striking a desalination facility on Keshm Island, something Washington did not confirm. Then, the very next day, Bahrain reported that an Iranian drone had damaged a desalination plant on its own territory. That exchange matters far more than most people realize, because the Gulf does not merely use desalination as a backup, it depends on it for survival. Around 400 desalination plants across Gulf states produce roughly 40% of the world's desalinated water. Bahrain relies on these systems for around 90% of its drinking water. Kuwait depends on them in roughly the same way. Oman is deeply reliant on them too. Saudi Arabia also depends heavily on them. These are not optional facilities. They are not emergency reserves. They are the daily water lifeline for tens of millions of people. During the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War, Iraq destroyed much of Kuwait's desalination capacity, and recovery took years. But today, the scale is much larger. Roughly 100 million people across the region depend on these systems every single day. So if water infrastructure is now entering the targeting logic of this war, the implications are massive. Iran's message appears brutally simple. If our water is hit, yours can be hit too. And yours means the Gulf states that host American troops. That changes the political calculation for every Arab government trying to avoid becoming a battlefield for someone else's war. So now step back and look at the full picture. Bases are being emptied, embassies are closing, troops are pulling back, shipping lanes are breaking down, oil markets are panicking, fertilizer prices are rising, water infrastructure is entering the target cycle, allies are refusing to join. And the public messaging from Washington is getting more contradictory by the week. That contradiction is where the absence of a clear plan becomes hardest to hide. Trump reportedly told one outlet on March 1st that the conflict would last around 4 weeks. Then, on March 6th, he said there were no time limits. On March 10th, he described the war as very complete. That same day, Defense Secretary Hegseth reportedly said on national television that this was only the beginning. A reporter later asked Trump which statement was true, and he answered, "You could say both." But those two statements cannot both be true in any meaningful strategic sense. Either the war is nearly wrapped up, or it is only beginning. Either there is a timeline or there's not. Either the operation has a defined end state or it does not. And the more these contradictions pile up, the harder it becomes to believe that anyone is steering with a coherent map. White House messaging only added to the confusion. One spokesperson suggested the initial timeline was 4 to 6 weeks. Then Trump reportedly said Iran was ready to make a deal, but that the terms were not good enough. The next day, Iran's foreign minister publicly said Iran had never asked for a ceasefire. That is not a small difference in interpretation. That is a direct contradiction between the public claims of both sides. And when that happens in the middle of a war, it often means one of two things. Either diplomacy is failing behind the scenes, or political messaging is being shaped for domestic audiences, rather than reflecting battlefield reality. Plan A appears to have been built around air superiority, regime destabilization, and then some kind of negotiated outcome. But the regime did not collapse. A new IRGC commander was reportedly appointed within 24 hours. A new supreme leadership arrangement was reportedly installed within a week. The ceasefire idea was publicly rejected. No ally stepped forward to reopen Hormuz militarily. One senior State Department counterterrorism official reportedly resigned and said Iran had posed no imminent threat before the strikes began. And if all of that is true, then the obvious question becomes unavoidable. Where exactly is Plan B? Because if there is no coalition, no stable end state, no agreed path to de-escalation, and no willingness from allies to share the burden, then this war is not being sustained by strategy. It is being sustained by momentum, denial, and the hope that the other side blinks first. Meanwhile, the economics of the conflict are turning against Washington in a very dangerous way. A single Patriot interceptor costs between roughly $3 and $4 million. The Shahed drones those interceptors are shooting down can cost Iran somewhere around $20,000 to $50,000. That is an astonishing imbalance. Iran does not need to overwhelm American defenses with giant waves forever. It only needs to keep forcing expensive responses to relatively cheap threats. Analysts have pointed out that Gulf states could run out of interceptors before Iran runs out of drones. Missile and drone launch rates may be lower now than on day one, but Iran has not stopped. It fires in smaller numbers, 1 or 2 at a time, at commercial and civilian-linked targets, forcing air defense systems to remain active around the clock. Every alert burns readiness. Every interception burns money. Every day of this burns political patience. Iran does not necessarily need a dramatic battlefield victory. It only needs to make the war more expensive to continue than to end, and right now, that may be exactly what it is doing. So the real question is no longer whether the United States is pulling back. That part is already visible through the withdrawals, the closures, the repeated evacuations, and the softened language surrounding them. The deeper question is what happens when a government runs out of words to disguise what it still refuses to name. What happens when repositioning starts looking like retreat, when temporary disruption starts looking like strategic failure, and when a regional conflict starts rewriting energy markets, shipping patterns, alliance politics, and civilian infrastructure risk all at once? Because at that point, this is no longer just a Middle East war story. It becomes a story about whether the world's strongest military can still impose order on a battle space where cheap drones, selective choke points, damaged radars, and fractured alliances are changing the rules in real time. And that is why this matters, far beyond the bases now being emptied. Because if the current trend continues, the next phase of this crisis may not be defined by a single spectacular strike. It may be defined by slow strategic erosion, where every day the costs rise, the options narrow, and the language gets softer because the reality is getting harder to defend. That is the bigger picture I wanted to show you today. Not just what is happening on the ground, but what the pattern suggests when you connect the troop withdrawals, the embassy closures, the Hormuz disruption, the water infrastructure threat, and the absence of allied support. Because once you connect those dots, this stops looking like a confident military campaign and starts looking like a widening crisis with no clean exit in sight. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Who do you think is really gaining the upper hand in this war? Do you think this conflict is already slipping beyond control? And do you believe the economic fallout could become even more dangerous than the battlefield itself? Share your opinion below because I really want to hear your take. And if you want more sharp analysis like this on global conflict, power shifts, and economic shockwaves, then subscribe to Market Mindset right now. Like this video, share it with others, and stay with us for the next update because this story is still unfolding